6-year-old Tim Willis watched as the London docks blazed. The sky, turning blood red before his eyes, reminded him of a sunset. Ushered into a shelter alongside his family, the young boy sat, frightened, while his father read aloud to calm his nerves. Stella Marion Pickering, of the same age, had a similar experience when her mother woke her up in the middle of the night. She soon found herself beneath the dining table as the noise of anti-aircraft fire became deafening. On another occasion in Middlesbrough, beneath a leaky corrugated steel arch, 13-year-old Margaret Burt Hamilton listened to the sirens wailing outside. It was amid the clamour that her mother made an announcement. She, like Stella, like Tim, and like so many other children caught up in the Blitz, was to be evacuated to Canada. Hello and welcome to the Past Blast YouTube channel. My name's Alex Bowers and my partner and I have just moved to Anwes, Nova Scotia. It's a beautiful part of the country and it's not dramatically far from the city of Halifax. It was here about 80 years ago that British evacuees first arrived in this country to find distant sanctuary away from the Blitz. I first came across the story of British evacuees in Canada, which took place under an organisation known as the Children's Overseas Reception Board, or CORB for short, while writing about it in Britain at War magazine. This publication, available in the UK and internationally, has helped make this video possible. I'd also like to thank the Canadian Museum of Immigration at Pier 21 for their outstanding cooperation and involvement in the project. And before we go any further, please consider liking and subscribing to the Past Blast YouTube channel. Your support is vital in the telling of these stories. As early as 1938, long before the bombs were being dropped on London and other places in Britain, Canadian newspapers, organisations and individuals had pleaded for their nation to play a role in evacuation, should the need arise. By that stage, however, Canada already had a complicated history with hosting Britain's youth. Between the 1860s and the 1930s, an immigration scheme involving poverty-stricken or orphaned juveniles had seen so-called home children resettling in rural households across the Dominion. Despite some home children experiencing a better life, many endured forced labour, exploitation and abuse. Evacuees sent to Canada during the Second World War did not face these same hardships for the most. The first children to arrive were of mostly British upper-class families with the means to send their sons and daughters without government support, even in the months before the war. But when the Germans invaded Poland in September 1939, it became apparent that a more widespread scheme was needed, a domestic scheme known as Operation Pied Piper. Thousands of children carrying their belongings boarded trains bound for the British countryside. Nevertheless, many returned home in the following months as the so-called phony war called into question the scheme's necessity. Yet the ultimate fall of France and the Dunkirk evacuations became a sobering reminder of Nazi intentions. When once Operation Pied Piper was considered premature, now, for some, it didn't go far enough. Renewed invitations poured in from across the British Empire, not only Canada, but also Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. Thus, on June 20th, 1940, the British government announced the establishment of the Children's Overseas Reception Board. By 11 AM on its opening day, some 3,000 people had lined up outside the central office in London. A total of 201,168 applicants were received within just 2 weeks, so many that the processing of further applicants was suspended on July 4th due to sheer numbers. Accepted families broke the news to their young loved ones, with many children expressing dismay at the thought of having to leave their parents behind. But unfortunately, for some, separation was the least of their concerns. Between the United Kingdom and Canada lay thousands of miles of U-boat infested waters. In order to reach their distant sanctuary, evacuees boarded ships for the crossing over several days. In many respects, their journey was short. For children like Bristol-based and New Zealand-bound James Porter, departing with his older sister Joyce from the Liverpool docks and travelling in convoy via Halifax, their trip would take weeks until they arrived at their final destination, and all the while fraught with risk. Then 10 years old, he recently spoke to me about his experiences.
We were the centre of convoy OB205, bound from Liverpool to Halifax and thence on to New Zealand. To our right, not far away, was the Dutch liner Volendam, carrying the evacuee children to Canada. A lone destroyer patrolled between the columns of ships, causing great excitement each time it passed. Unbeknown to us, however, U-boats lurked ahead of us, and the convoy was attacked late in the evening of the 30th of August. I was suddenly awoken by thumping noises and the sound of alarm bells. We put on our lifebelts and stumbled our way to the boat stations on the first-class deck, and on the way sighting the Volendam, brightly lit and apparently on fire, falling astern of us. Someone said that a lookout on the front of our ship had actually seen the torpedo passing us just a yard ahead of the Rangitata, before it hit the unfortunate ship. We heard that the convoy had been ordered to scatter and felt the engines below vibrating as the ship picked up speed. It was probably a terrifying night for the older children and adults, but I found it an exciting experience. There was chatter, chaos, hot bovril and biscuits to see us through until morning. Despite being late summer, it was quite chilly, and we were eventually taken under cover and fell asleep on the soft, luxurious carpet of the lounge.
Miraculously, no children aboard Volendam were killed, and indeed, the vast majority of journeys involved no major incidents, with children afforded the chance to make friends, watch films, and eat the most substantial meals since rationing began in Britain. This was not destined to be the case for the SS City of Benares. In September 1940, a torpedo struck the vessel close to the stern, where the children slept, killing many outright. More drowned as the cold Atlantic swept into their cabins. Others, though many were wounded, fled onto the deck before clambering into lifeboats. As evacuees succumbed to the elements or injuries, survivors spent a dark, stormy night floating helplessly until rescue arrived. A total of 77 out of 90 Corps children lost their lives attempting to sail for Canada. The Corps scheme was in essence disbanded shortly after, but for those evacuees already in Canada and other countries, their experiences were only just beginning. One of those who remembered the moment she docked fondly was Marjorie Coates, who had landed about a month before the City of Benares sinking. Her highlight was the sight of a Mountie standing beside the pier as she disembarked. Eventually nicknamed war guests, the evacuees often arrived at Pier 21 in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where they went through the immigration process before being officially accepted into the country. Most then boarded trains and ventured further inland to the likes of Montreal, Toronto, Winnipeg and Vancouver, often greeted by large crowds and members of the press. Once each evacuee had been assigned to a Canadian foster family, their new lives could begin. This meant exploring their Canadian surroundings, attending Canadian schools, making Canadian friends, and enjoying Canadian pastimes such as skiing, ice skating, tobogganing, and of course hockey, as well as general fun and games. These photographs of John Hakings show he took full advantage of his Canadian adventure, as did Margaret Burt Hamilton, who had endured the bombs falling in Middlesbrough, but now found herself on roller skates in her new world. Meanwhile, evacuees were able to maintain transatlantic connections through letters, parcels, and even the occasional telegram. For a privileged few, there were also radio broadcasts, courtesy of the BBC and Canada's CBC. One of the children offered the opportunity to speak to her parents directly was Margaret Beale. Talking to her family for approximately 2 minutes on Christmas Day, 1940, she fell in love with the microphone and in later life became a famous CBC radio and television personality. As evacuees grew older, some met Canadian sweethearts and ultimately married. Others reached enlistment age, where they joined the Canadian Armed Forces or returned home to serve their country. This was the same story in other countries where evacuees had been sent. Among them was Anwes Owen, who had been shipped out to South Africa, had completed her education out there, and had later joined the Swans, the nation's equivalent to the Royal Navy's renowned Wrens. Anwes would go on to perform anti-submarine duties around Cape Town. A curious turn of events for a former child sent away from conflict, only to play a critical role in the Allied war effort. Back in Canada, there were still instances of tragedy, including at least 3 evacuees losing their lives, 2 of illness and 1 in a freak accident. Children likewise received word that family members back home had been killed in the fighting overseas or during raids over Britain. When victory was declared in Europe in May 1945, 1,532 Corps children and many more private evacuees had resided in Canada for up to 5 years. A further 577 had gone to Australia, 353 to South Africa, and 202 to New Zealand. Though their time in their host countries was drawing to a close, the memories made, friendships forged, and identities imprinted would tie them forever with the land they left behind. For some, especially those who had left Britain in their earlier years, the jubilance of returning home was tinged with trepidation for what the future held in a country they couldn't remember. Bittersweet reunions saw former evacuees and families struggle to recognise each other or show bemusement at adopted Canadian accents. In their absence, grandparents and childhood pets had died, fathers had divorced their mothers or had been killed, while tens of thousands of civilians had died in the Blitz or as victims of Nazi Germany's V weapons. And so, not every child was able to reintegrate into a Britain still reeling from the harsh realities of war. James Porter, who had travelled to New Zealand with his sister Joyce, remembers the conflicting feelings he experienced upon seeing his mother again.
My sister Joyce and I travelled to Bristol, where we met our mother at Templemead Station. Dad was still away in Germany. We were completely amazed at the damage everywhere, and were glad when we finally arrived at our new home. That evening, talk was difficult, almost to a point of embarrassment. 5 years had passed, and it seemed we were complete and utter strangers, with little or nothing in common. Finally, it was off to bed. As I tried to sleep, I could hear my sister sobbing in the next room. She had been so loved by her foster parents and was now very homesick. Our great adventure of a lifetime was over, and our lives would never be the same. Some weeks later, my father returned home. I didn't know him either. As time passed, things never really changed. Over the years we did meet and spent time together, but that precious family something was missing, and it was gone forever.
A proportion of former evacuees made difficult choices over the coming months and years. Those disillusioned by post-war Britain chose instead to emigrate to Canada or elsewhere, thereby making their adopted homes their real homes. In 1957, Tim Willis, whose memories of the London docks burning were eclipsed by happier memories overseas, bought a one-way ticket to Canada. John Hughes, who had initially been evacuated just shy of his teenage years, likewise returned after the war, attended a Canadian university, started a family, and ran a pharmacy in the 1960s. Stories such as these were relatively common. Indeed, hundreds of former evacuees made the same choice. As for the ones who remained in Britain, they rarely lost contact with their foster families, vowing one day to meet again. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you would like to find out more information about British evacuees in Canada, I would urge you to look up the September 2022 issue of Britain at War magazine. This is available in print and digital copies via the Key Publishing website, the links of which I've added in the description below. Britain at War covers a wide range of wartime stories, not only of Britain but also of the Commonwealth nations, including Canada. I'd also urge you to visit the Canadian Museum of Immigration at Pier 21 if you wish to delve deeper into the stories of overseas evacuation and more. That's it from me, so I'll say thank you very much for watching, and I hope you'll join me for another episode of Past Blasts soon.